You know, being a wildlife cameraman, I really do think I'm probably one of the luckiest people. I actually get to see some amazing places and some amazing things. But coming back to Rhayader always inspires me. It's very, very beautiful, the reservoirs and the hills and the lovely valleys. But for me, it's the wildlife here that attracts me. In the early 80s, I used to guard the nests of things like red kites here. But in those days, people were highly protective of their kite's nest and simply wouldn't discuss them with you. In fact, they denied they had them. And it was wonderful because people seriously protected them. And look at the change in the story. Now we have kites all over the place. People come from all over America, from Japan, just to come and see them. They are one of the world's most endangered species, and if you stand in the middle of Rhayader and look up, you'll see them all day long. We're actually guardians of a very, very special bird. It's also probably one of the most beautiful birds of prey in the whole world. We have an amazingly privileged position here in terms of the landscape and the wildlife.
Here we are on Cefn Nuntmel, looking west to Rhayader, a few miles away, just the other side of Castle Bank. And this wonderful amphitheatre created by Camlaw Hill is a wonderful viewpoint for looking over to the Cambrian Mountains, Eleniz as the old name for it is. We're looking out over a landscape that's been moulded thousands of years ago by the ice, and then it melted 12,000 or so years ago. The impact really of the ice was to leave us with this wonderful high plateau area, remembering that a lot of what we're looking at here is over 1,000 feet, and remember also that Radnorshire, in terms of the old counties of Wales, is second only to Breconshire in having more land over 1,000 feet than any other county in Wales, and I think that is clearly seen here. Probably one of the most significant historical footprints of this area is the link with Prince Llewellyn, that in 1282, when he was murdered by English soldiers at Kilmerry near Builth, his head was sent to London and his body was reputedly taken to Abbey Cumhir. Abbey Cumhir was a very significant monastery, and its nave length was, I think, only bettered by Canterbury, that it was a massive, massive monastery. And when it was destroyed, many of the stones were dismantled and taken to various places all around this area. So many of the farms around here have many of the stones of the monastery incorporated in them. And in Llanidloes Church, the great arches from the monastery are included in the church in Llanidloes and well worth seeing. So it's nice to know that although that wonderful monastery, which must have looked so impressive in that long valley with its wooded slopes, was actually destroyed, that the history still lives on in the farmhouses around. It's interesting to wonder just what sort of landscape those monks would have been living with then. It would have been a lot more wooded, and the flower patterns must have been out of this world, because we have today just little pockets of some lovely old meadows left in this area. It's interesting that when we look back at the statistics for 1888, within Radnorshire, there was 5,000 hectares of oats being grown in this landscape. And by the 1980s, 100 years later, we had 200. Today, it is mostly a sheep graze landscape with a few clumps of woods and trees. Bluebell woods provide some of the most globally important sources of bluebells, and it's been found that the chemicals in the bluebell have great significance for some cancer-fighting drugs, and yet the Spanish bluebell doesn't have it. So we're very lucky to have still just hanging on to some of that wonderful biodiversity that must have covered all of this landscape up until really intensification in the mid-20th century. So it's very important we don't lose any more.
This is spring, of course. There's a lot going on. All the birds are nesting and the lambs are in the fields.
lots of interesting sounds to be heard, and all the greens, of course, are really fresh, aren't they, and vibrant. And just have a listen here and see what we can hear here in the way of bird song. Because if you've got a bit of dense shrubbery like this, or an overgrown hedge, or a mixture of bit of trees and open areas and shrubberies, that's often where you hear the most bird song. And just have a listen here and see what we can hear. Distant wood pigeon cooing. A willow warbler up in the top here, that descending. Yeah, that's the willow warbler. That's come all the way from Africa. Pheasant there. And over there behind you, there's a blackbird singing, oh, I can see it there, and a song thrush. There. Do you hear that? That repeated, each phrase is repeated 3 times, that song thrush. Swallows going over. Chaffinch here. Pheasant again. And that little bubbling warble here. A bird of bramble thickets and overgrown hedgerows, very thick shrubberies. There. It's a garden warbler. Little nondescript bird, really. In one of the books it describes it as a bird that's easily distinguishable because it has no distinguishing features. Anyway, and that's coming from Africa too. There's a lot of noise, a lot of sound. Little wren there, so loud for such a tiny little bird. Fabulous time of year.
Here we are by Dolamunach, the one dam that wasn't actually built to the height that it was originally planned. And it's given us here some sort of idea of what the Dol was like. Dol Amunach is the meadow of the monks. So again we have this association with the monks of Abbaticum here, of Strata Florida, and their connection with this huge great grange area that they had. Up there on the other side of Dolamunach is Craigamunach. So again the rocks of the monks. Was this part of their way down? Dolamunach was obviously these lovely flat fields where maybe the monks stopped and grazed their animals when they were moving over to maybe to Abicum here, or brought their animals up here for the summer. Francis Payne comes out with a very nice quote, I think, which describes some of this link of the history of the area to today, when he writes, ai boddi y marfro hon a'i hanes mor anwahanadwy a dyn a'i gysgod, which means although it has been drowned, this area and its history are as inseparable as a man and his shadow. Today we associate these names with the reservoirs, but obviously they were very, very magic valleys before the reservoirs, and Francis Payne talks very eloquently about how the valley must have been before it was drowned. Afon oedd fel gleiniau gleision ar linen gwyn. That translates as, it was like a river, like blue beads on a white thread. And I think that's because the Ellen and the Clawin are both tumbling their way down from the tops of Olenydd, from the plateau on the top. And in their tumbling way, they have these wonderful waterfalls. Rhayader is a waterfall. So this is very much the country of waterfalls and running water.
The sort of things that draw me to Dolamunach really are the birds, particularly in the spring. There could be goosanders or maybe even a hunting osprey or something like that on the lookout for some fish passing by on its way north. And in the winter there might be a range of ducks here, things like tufted ducks and pochard and perhaps some little grebes. There's always something to see at Dolamunach. And here's a really good illustration of the goosander. This is the female here with her chocolate brown head and grey back. It's a little bit bigger than a mallard. And this is the drake, the magnificent drake really, that has these creamy coloured sides to it. This is the one that we see every day pretty well, and certainly throughout the summer, often with a whole group of young ones following the female. One of the dilemmas about having goosanders locally here is, of course, there's great controversy about whether they're eating too many fish, because they are principally fish eaters, and you see them fishing along the rivers and obviously catching quite a lot of fish. And I think the fishermen generally think this is a serious threat to their fishing. But there are plenty of parts of the world where you get goosanders and lots of fish. The males don't hang around in the summer months, that they leave to molt, and it was never really known where they go to molt. And it's just recently been discovered that we've had a young one that was ringed here on the River Wye that turned up in Norway. So it had flown all the way back from here to molt in Norway, which is where they originated from. And I always remember coming here probably 3 years ago now. It was in the early part of the spring when the crows had their young ones. And I always remember looking at this riffle here, right here, and seeing an adult crow teaching the young crow how to fish. But what was happening was the adult crow was standing on one of these boulders right here, and where the riffles are going right by it, and little tiddlers were coming up through the riffles, and it was waiting and then picking a little tiddler up and taking it off to the young crow to feed it, and it was standing on the shingle further away, and clearly it was teaching this young crow to do this. And I think that tells us quite a lot about nature generally, the fact that it's constantly changing. We think of it as something that is just a static thing, always going to be the same, but it's constantly changing, and animals are constantly evolving.
Here's a wonderful living ancient monument. Amazing oak tree. How can you get it? If there's one habitat that really appeals to me, it's these wonderful ancient trees. They're so rare internationally, I'm told. I think it's thought that something like 80% of all the old trees in northwest Europe occur in this country. We've been fortunate that the history of a place like the Elan Valley, like Rhayader, peppered with old trees. As we come here, we got the remains of a medieval deer park at Devanna. Still some of the old trees buried in conifers, but still just about surviving. Here at the Elan Valley, we've got these wonderful old estates like Nant Gwylt, which valued the trees because of the beauty of them, for the shooting, the sporting, and as a result, they've miraculously survived. And they're wonderful for wildlife. I mean, what sort of birds would you find in a nursery like this?
Well, I mean, for me, I'm always drawn to the ancient trees because they're often hollow, aren't they? Really big hollows in them, and holes even on the limbs as you go out. So I'm looking for things like the tawny owl, that's often nesting them, and perhaps barn owls too. There are a scattering of barn owls around Rhayader, and they're usually nesting in old trees. There are some in buildings, but quite a lot of them are in trees locally.
This is a nightmare tree for a forester, but of course a tree that a forester would like, with big, straight, clean, no rot holes, useless in the main for wildlife. Just supports, to my eye, just a few very common species that turn up in an average privet hedge in suburbia. Yeah. And we're slowly learning that trees with hollow centres and so on, rot holes in them, this is not something that should be viewed as being unpleasant, disease. This is a natural process. An oak tree spends 300 years growing, it stands for 300 years, and it gently decays for 300 years, is what it said. Yeah. And in that process, it hollows itself out, makes itself lighter, recycles the nutrients inside, and creates an amazing welter of habitats for beetles, bugs, birds.
So how old do you reckon this is then?
Well, it's very difficult. In somewhere like the Elan Valley, very little soil, it probably grows very slowly, less than a centimetre in circumference per year.
Go on, make a stab at it.
400
years old,
maybe.
450.
The hole up here is producing nutrient-rich water when it rains. The rot in the centre is dribbling down here and ameliorating the acidity on the bark so that it's suitable for this whole range of lichen species to grow. And this little moss called Zygodon occurs in this rain track here from that one wound above. So these wonderful ancient trees create this great range of conditions. The holes, of course, are absolutely vital to a whole species of wildlife. I mean, where, for example, did bats go before we built houses and churches? This particular lichen only tends to occur in ancient trees. They've got to be really old. As trees get older, the bark chemistry changes quite subtly. A tree like this will probably have 60 to 70 different sorts of lichens on.
Can you call that little smudge something attractive?
Magnify it up and it's incredibly beautiful, looking down the microscope as well. But it also tells us a lot about the history of a place. So, for example, this one, because it's about here, in fact there's 2 or 3 species in this little patch here, tell me that this is a piece of ancient woodland which has probably never been clear felled in the past. There's always been some trees standing here, because once you chop all the trees down, many of these species just vanish. They're such poor colonisers, they just can't get back in. So chop all the trees down and they're lost. So the woodlands of the Elan Valley in particular are important, because there's been this long continuity of mature trees standing on the spot. And of course, and it mirrors the insects as well. 1,300 different sorts of insects recorded from ancient trees that don't turn up in younger trees. Not all here, I have to say, but in an amazing diversity.
It's a real treat, Ray.
It's a whole new world, a little forest of microorganisms just clinging to the bark there. By looking after an ancient tree like this and the trees around about, we can look after as many as 600 to 700 additional species of wildlife just associated with a few old oak trees.
Many common plants which are seen by gardeners to be hateful weeds are in fact really good medicinal plants, and they have some really special, wonderful properties. We've got plantain down here, and the leaves and the flowers and seed heads can be used to make a medicine to treat coughs and soothe sore throats. And also the leaves are good for, if you crush the leaves, if you get stung by a wasp, if you crush the leaves and put it on the sting, it helps keep the sting away and just cool the sting. And you wouldn't necessarily think that such plants have got such really good properties. It's a very soothing plant, plantain. And then we've got goosegrass, which is the bane of every gardener's life. If you've got this in the garden, you just can't get rid of it. But this time of the year, it's great to pick. You can dry it and make tea out of it, or you can actually cook it like spinach and eat it as a fresh vegetable. It's a bit stringy, but it's good for the immune system, so it actually gives your body a boost in the spring, like a spring tonic, after the dull months of winter, really. So next time you see your goosegrass, it's actually quite a friendly plant if you know how to use it. Here's another weed, the dandelion, which is a wonderful plant. Lots of really good medicinal properties in the dandelion. The leaves, you can eat the young fresh leaves in a salad, they're really good. A good bitter for your digestive system, to help your digestive system work properly, help clear things through. And do you remember the old wives' tale when we were children? Don't pick the dandelions because you'll wet the bed. Well, it's true, dandelions are a strong diuretic, and they won't necessarily make you wet the bed, but they're used to treat people who have kidney infections, or if there's trouble with kidney stones or gallstones, and they're really effective diuretic. But because the whole plant is used, it's very balanced. It's a very balanced way of treating, because if your doctor gives you diuretics, then you're probably going to need some potassium to balance the body's all the body's minerals. But there is a lot of potassium already in dandelions, so if you take dandelions, it's all in there. It's doing it all in one go, so it's really good. Here we have hawthorn, which is really common in all the hedgerows. It's a really excellent herbal medicine. It contains cardiac glycosides, which works on your heart and the blood circulation. It's really magical. If your heart is beating too fast, it actually slows your heart down. But if your heart is beating too slow, it actually speeds your heart up. This is the time when you'd harvest hawthorn. We use the young buds just before the flowers open and the dried leaves. And the berries, we can also use the berries. But these contain the most chemicals, so you'd pick these and dry them very carefully. The silver birch is a lovely, lovely tree. It's all moving and elegant, it's lovely, and it's used in herbal medicine to get things moving. It clears out the systems, and it's used specifically for skin problems such as eczema or psoriasis. They make the medicine out of the young leaves, and to make internal medicines to treat the conditions. And also they can use the inside of the bark, which used to be used to place actually on the skin to treat eczema and those kinds of conditions. It's a really lovely, gentle, cleansing herb. And this is where you get birch tar oil from as well, which again is made specifically to treat the skin problems. It doesn't smell very nice or even look very nice. It's got a strange smoky smell about it. But it's really, really good, very gentle. The willow is another common tree in the area, and this plant is where they discovered aspirin, the source of aspirin. And in herbal medicine, the willow is used to treat fevers and for pain relief because of the salicin content, which is the basis of aspirin. It's also good for rheumatism and rheumatic conditions and gout and that sort of thing, sort of a clearing out sort of herb. But it's generally used for reducing fevers and as an analgesic.
Wendy recommends that you seek the advice of a qualified herbalist before making or using any herbal medicines. Arthur Price's family have farmed at Ashfield Llanuthor since 1917. What are his earliest memories of working the land?
Oh, well, when I left school I had to go follow the horses, ploughing, and then sowing whatever, oats, wheat or barley, and then harrowing it with the horses. Sometimes I'd got 3 going. And then cutting it by hand, tying it up by hand, the corn, and stooking it. And if there's a wettish time, which we get wet seasons in Wales, I had to turn them inside out maybe to get them dry. And once we got them dry, we hauled them in the building. Then you got to take manure out to grow a crop of Swedes the following year. And then the same thing happens on the 3rd year to grow either oats, wheat or barley crop. And you would put a clover seed ley down with it, which would be hay the following year. All rotation just in those days. Of course, the tractor came along in the late 40s, which took over a lot of hard work. It was all right with the horses, but we didn't know no different. You see, with the tractor come, and that made a vast difference in time and comfort. Of course, we had to buy fresh implements then to go behind the tractor. Not so much the binder, we converted that with a long pole. With the binder, cut it and tied it, and throwed it out in a sheaf, which you could regulate what size you like. We had two furrows on the tractor, which we only had 1 behind the horses. You plough an acre a day with horses, which you could plough 4 or 5 acres in the day with a tractor. I remember the shearing day all done by hand. In 1958 they started shearing with a machine. Of course, a lot of the fellas and neighbours were saying it was too bare. But anyway, everybody's doing it now.
In 1964, a visitor to Rhayader photographed the shearing at Ashfield. At that time, the farm had a sheep walk at Timawa, Langirig, and so sheep were walked from Timawa through Rhayader to Ashfield for shearing.
They used to like the sheep all washed in the 50s, but it got that they were giving more money for unwashed wool, any with more weight, than the washed wool. But it was nicer to shear a sheep that was washed because there wasn't the grease in it. Yes, washing sheep was all right. They'd get used to jumping in. Biggest half of them would jump in and swim through the river. If it was a hot day, I felt like going through after them. The first year my wife came here, I was 54, and as she'll tell you today, we were, I think, 54 at her first shearing. That was people inside what I call the canteen people, and the ones working outside. We'd shear about 800 or 900 wool sheep during the day on the last flock we had, which we gave up in 1986. These sheep were all tied up out on bedding on the yard. Most of them got to be pitched different because they were different ages, and some sale sheep in them which are going to be pitched different again.
What was the hardest work?
Well, hauling bales perhaps, but I tell you what, when you finished hauling bales you were feeling pretty fit, and catching sheep at shearing time, because they both mostly clashed. But if you were hauling bales and handling sheep, there wasn't many muscles in the body that wasn't used.
What changes have you noticed in the wildlife on the farm?
We haven't got a curlew, nor a peaweed, for at least 12, 15 years now. And we got a big Ross across the fields here. There'd be hundreds, well, yes, I can say hundreds of them there, swirling round in the air and calling. You'd hear two coming in February on a niceish night, two curlews. They'd be called just an odd call. They'd be coming in, but there'd be hundreds there by April.
Has the valley changed much?
Oh yes, the village has anyway. You could go through the village with a horse and cart years ago, and depending on what you'd got on, the cart or gambo, sitting down on it sometimes when I'd go into the little farm the other side of the river, and you'd see one Mrs. Reese Thomas or Mrs. Evans at the lodge, and Mrs. Lloyd up at the school. And these new houses that arrived today, built in 1952, 3 and 4, and you go through the village today and you don't hardly see a soul. But the television, the telephone and the motor car has spoilt all rural life, I think. People were at home in them days and they'd go out for a walk perhaps, but you'd always meet someone to talk to a few minutes. I wasn't a very big talker because I'd got a job to do.
When I walk into an ancient woodland, I like to locate the old trees and see what's nesting in them. And it's these ancient trees that usually have the nesting redstarts and pied flycatchers. And I always think that when I hear a redstart singing, some people might refer to the yellowhammer as saying, a little bit of bread and no cheese. And it's rather like that, it's a phrase rather like that from a redstart, but it's a coarse version of it. And I always think that if you're in a woodland and you hear a bird going, a little bit of bread and no cheese, or else, that's the redstart singing. And if you remember that, I always think it's easier to remember birds' song by applying a little phrase or other to it. And it's these trees that those redstarts are nesting in, not necessarily ancient trees, but it's always worth checking the ancient trees for redstarts. And they nest in a cavity in the tree, as do pied flycatchers. The pied flycatcher and the redstart are two birds that are coming up from Africa. They're wintering south of the Sahara, sensible you might think, spending our winter there. And they're coming up to this part of the world just to nest. So they're only here for a relatively short period of the time. And there's a time in the middle of April when you wake up in the morning, perhaps one day there are no pied flycatchers or redstarts in the wood, and then you wake up one morning and the woodlands are full of pied flycatchers and redstarts. And that's because they're night migrants. They're flying at night all the way from Africa and just falling into our woodlands, usually around about the middle of April. But by the middle of June, the whole breeding season is over for them and they're making their way back to Africa. Certainly in the case of the pied flycatcher, you don't see many of them in July. We're lucky, in a way, that redstarts linger a bit longer and you can see those through to September. One of the really interesting things about pied flycatchers is that they just can't resist nest boxes. And this box here has got a pied flycatcher there sitting on eggs at the moment. She's got 7 eggs, 7 of these sky blue eggs that are so stunning when you open the box. Now it's okay to open a box if you happen to have got a box in your garden or on your land somewhere with pied flycatchers in. It's okay to have an occasional peep, and pied flycatchers are particularly tolerant really. Sometimes she'll be sitting there and you won't want to disturb her, but maybe if you go back in a day or two's time she's off feeding and you can see the eggs. And the interesting thing about pied flycatcher nests is that the material they're made of is entirely dry. It's bits of it's bits of grass, dry grass and leaves, oak leaves and that sort of thing. So you can always tell whether there's a pied flycatcher nesting in a nest box or a blue tit. A blue tit's nest is always moss and lots of green moss and those little white eggs with the brown speckles on. The redstart is probably one of our most beautiful small birds. It's about the size of a robin, very colourful with the orange front and the blue-grey back and the black throat. And these birds, these key birds, the pied flycatcher and the redstart that we're really proud of locally, they're actually very scarce across most of the rest of the country. You could say that Mid Wales, this area of Mid Wales, is the centre of the population of redstarts and pied flycatchers. Nowhere will you find greater numbers of those birds in the woodlands. And we've got to be thinking about how we're going to make sure that there are ancient trees and just old trees and young trees, of course. You need all ages of trees in a woodland, and that's what we've got to make sure is always going to be here for these birds and all the other wildlife.
Sammy Males has been fishing local rivers for over 60 years. Sammy's also been making flies which mimic local insects and conditions for as long as he can remember.
Now, have you ever seen a sawfly?
Yes.
It's a little fly with a thick, small body, but he had hells of big wings. You don't see them now, they're all gone. But I seen the lakes up at Ponterwyd and Rhayader. I seen it erupt with fish. You think it's spots of rain. That's what they wanted. And if you didn't have it, you wouldn't catch. The locals call it a wasp because it looks like a wasp.
Yeah.
It lays green eggs.
Yeah. It's interesting what you're saying about the sawfly, because in terms of what I do, sawfly isn't a fly at all. It is actually a kind of wasp.
That's right.
Yeah, which are non-stinging. The adult females have got a little saw on the end of their tails.
Yes, yeah.
And they actually saw their way into vegetation, tree stems to actually lay an egg. And sometimes I've been up the Elm Valley and there's been a big hatching and some of the birch sawflies, which obviously occurs on birch trees.
Yes, yeah.
And you can physically, there's hundreds of them, and you can hear them squeaking the saws, and literally you can hear them when they're still there.
You can hear
soaring into the wood, which is unbelievable. So I can understand why they call them sawflies.
Yes, yeah.
Sammy makes another fishing fly to mimic a Coco Bundy beetle.
There he is. That's the cocoa. That's what they take for the Coco Bundy. See that feather? See that glint?
Yeah.
An old man told me years ago, if you tie a dry fly and there's no fire in that feather, it's useless. It's no good.
Yeah.
And he's right.
Yeah. It is exactly like the beetle.
Yeah.
The big metallic green on the thorax, and the brown just matches the colour of the wing case. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
But it's a funny thing. Redweather is about the same height. It's the Clairwyn in the Inland Valley. But the Coco Bundy comes out a week or 10 days earlier on Redweather then you see it up on the clearing. You won't see the cocklebunny until the second week in June.
For Sammy, observing the weather is key to understanding how fish behave.
The temperature of the water will tell you what size fly to use. If it's cold, you use big flies to get down. When the water warms up, you use smaller flies because they'll come up. And on a bright day, you use a bright fly for salmon. Silver-bodied fly or something like that. And on a dull overcast day, you use a dull fly, a black-bodied one.
So tell us, why have you got so many flies? Why do you need so many though?
Eh?
Why? Why do you need so many flies? What's the...
Well, why do a mechanic want a big box of spanners for? Because he can't do the job with one spanner.
Yeah, same story then.
It's the same story.
Yeah.
Fish and birds depend on a rich diversity of insect life to survive. Phil is passionate about invertebrates and helped us to identify just a few of the thousands of insects that are found locally. One of our first finds was a green shield bug.
They do get mistaken for beetles, these, because they've got hardened wing cases like beetles have, but they tend to have this little membranous tip on the end of the wing there. And also, unlike beetles, which have jaws which bite, these have actually got big long siphons underneath the bodies that have like a little groove where actually it sits when they're not using it, and they flick it out, and then these mainly feed off plant juices and things and tree juices, but some of them are predators and they can suck other insects. Some very, very small flower bugs, small little black and white stripy ones, can actually suck human blood, so you've got to be very, very respectful of these things. Of course they're called a shield bug because they do look like a heraldic shield sort of shape. Should we put them back on the tree? There you go. Here's one of the medium-sized tortoise beetles, all green. We get some yellow ones as well, but they actually have grooves under the body where they pull the legs in, and the legs are very, very sticky on the end. They've got very sticky hairs really, and they grip the leaves really, really strongly. Unlike most of these kind of beetles, which actually fall off when something disturbs the actual tree or the plant they're on, they'll actually drop into the vegetation. When all's clear, they'll crawl up again. But these actually sit very, very tight onto the leaf and camouflage themselves, and they're quite flattened as well. Very, very hard to spot when they're sitting around. Lovely little things. These are quite local really. You do come across tortoise beetles occasionally. It's never a common beetle you find. They are generally common throughout Britain, but you don't find them everywhere really. It's not a species that sweeps all the time. You might get half a dozen a year maybe, so it's got quite a local one really. Another kind of leaf beetle. Well, most of the leaf beetles are quite round insects, and they're very, very metallic. The species which feed off dock, species on nettles, they tend to be specialists on certain plants. But most of them are very, very attractive when you get them under the microscope at home, and you can really get the colours, absolutely fantastic colours on them.
Phil also found a mayfly, one of the insects that Sammy often bases his fishing flies on.
Well, the mayfly is one of the aquatic flies. There's obviously stoneflies and caddisflies and mayflies, which are actually in separate orders, and they're all flies of actually wet areas, so the larvae have to actually use have to live under the water really, so they're actually fully aquatic. And then a lot of these mayflies can spend 1 or 2 or 3 years actually as larvae in the rivers, and then they hatch out obviously after them short period of time. There's a grub, and then they have to crawl out, and then they could live 3 or 4 days, and then they die. They just mate, lay eggs and die. And some of these smaller species of mayflies and caddisflies, the mouth parts aren't actually usable. They're sealed. They don't feed at all because they only live for 1 or 2 days. See his long tail sticking out behind his abdomen there, and the whole of their wings actually roof-wise closed at the top, unlike most other insects. It's very distinctive when they're sitting. Oh, he's off.
The River Wye is famous for its fish, and with Sammy's help we spotted some baby salmon.
That's from this year's eggs. That little fish there is. And when they're that size, They're aggressive. See him on that little bit of stone there? Now that's his home. Now if another little fish comes in there, by the side of him, he'll drive him out. He'll be in the river for 2 years maybe.
Yeah.
Then he'd go to sea. Now at that stage they call him a salmon fry. And when he gets to that size they call it a salmon par. And when he goes just a bit bigger he loses his spots and his finger marks. They're called a salmon smolt. And they all go silver. And they got one spot on the gill cover. But if you scrape the scales off it, you can see the finger marks under the scales. You watch a pair of salmon spawn, they turn on their side. And it's the end fish does all the work. She pushes the gravel up with her nose, like a bulldozer, and she fans it with her tail. And she's laying eggs at the same time. And the eggs go on and the stones go back on top of the eggs. And the cockfish puts his milk on the top of those stones. It's the same as a bread and butter pudding. You put a layer of bread and butter and then a layer of currants and some butter. Then you put another layer of bread and butter and then another layer of currants. It's the same thing when they do their bread. Well, they lay about 1,000 eggs to every pound weight of the fish. So a 16-pound fish lay about 16,000 eggs. And if 4 out of the 16,000 survive, that's a good average. Years ago, they never used to watch out until the end of March, beginning of April, when the weather got a bit kinder. And they had chance, they had feed and chance to grow. But the trouble now, we're having green winters, and they're hatching out in February instead of the end of March. And we seem to get the winters here now in March. As soon as them yows starts to land, I'll guarantee we'll have bad weather winter. I can guarantee it. And those little fish haven't got the feed.
So if you were to list the fish that were in the river when you were a boy, is the list any different? It's grayling, salmon, brown trout you've mentioned, minnow.
They're not here anymore.
No.
They're few and far between.
Yeah, they're sort of all here, but in much smaller numbers.
Yes. Well, years ago, from up the Martech now back to Rhayader, you heard of Bob, haven't you, Bobby Williams? Do you know a butcher's basket they used to deliver the meat with? He filled one of those with trout. From the Martech back to Rhayader, he fished and he filled a butcher's basket full.
Yeah.
Years ago. Yeah. You won't. What? You wouldn't do it from the source of the Wye down to the estuary now, because they're not there.
No. The rivers and streams around Rhayader are very important for a little suite of birds that we consider to be West Country birds, if you like. You know, they're mainly found along the west side of Britain where there are fast-flowing rivers like this. This is the River Wye, of course. Those birds are the dipper, which everyone may know, and the kingfisher, not so much a bird of fast-flowing rivers as the slow-flowing stretches of the Wye. But we do see them right up into Rhayader, into the town, and they like to nest in earthy banks that are right close to the river, overhanging the river usually. And then there's another bird called the common sandpiper, which is a curious bird. It's a wading bird, small brown wading bird, very white underneath but brown on the back. And it does this strange sort of bobbing action all the time. And you see them just in the summer months. We get them arriving in April and they're usually all gone by, perhaps August or something like that. And they're nesting quite close to the river usually, but they like to frequent these shingle banks These little shingly bits that you get along the river, and that's the places to look for them. Another one is the grey wagtail. The grey wagtail has actually got quite a lot of yellow on it. It's got a grey back and then the yellow underneath, and particularly on the undertail, very yellow there, and they're always associated with water, and they love fast-flowing streams, and they're nesting in places like an overhanging bank, under a bridge perhaps, or something like that. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there was a pair nesting under Cumdai, the bridge in the town here, and maybe by standing on the bridge you can see grey wagtails often on the rocks below the bridge. And the tail of a grey wagtail is ridiculously long, and they're called wagtails of course because they wag their tail, and you see this tail constantly wagging, and they've got white outer tail feathers as well, so they're wagging away, and that's another speciality really of these fast-flowing rivers and streams. The dipper's quite an interesting bird because it's quite closely related to the blackbird, and there are 5 species in the world, and they're found in the New and the Old World, but they fit into exactly the same niche, and that is that they're a bird that's evolved to feed off invertebrates underwater. So that if you watch a dipper on the river in one of the parks in Rhayader like this, you'll see them jump into the water, and they're running around, well, not running around so much as sort of moving around on the boulders underneath the water, and turning over little stones and picking up little invertebrates from the bottom of the river. And that's really quite a curious thing for dippers to have evolved worldwide. All 5 species feed in this way, and it rather makes you wonder how they've come to be like that when the niche is normally filled by ducks. It's ducks that normally feed underwater. It's always worth looking out for them anyway, along the rivers, anywhere around Rhayader, and they're a real treat to see.
Well, that was a lovely insight into this area, and it was so nice to see so many familiar faces. I do think we live in an incredible place, and we're so privileged to be here. And it's so nice to see that so many people are working towards keeping this for future generations.